Thank you. Ibrahim.
So it's an absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Amer Bisat. Dr. Bisat is an EUB alumnus, one whom we are very proud of. He's one of our best ambassadors to the world, and it's an absolute delight to welcome him back to his alma mater. Dr. Bisat has assumed very important roles in leading financial institutions during an illustrious career as an economist. He's currently a managing director at BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, where he leads the team handling investments in emerging market, corporate, and sovereign debt. Dr. Bisat will discuss Lebanon's negotiations with the IMF. As a former economist at the IMF himself, Dr. Bisat is very intimately aware of the contours of fund programs as well as conditionality. He has written extensively about Lebanon and Lebanon's economic challenges, and I've thoroughly enjoyed all of his articles and all of his interviews. So it's an absolute delight to have him with us today. I think you are all looking forward, just like I am, to hear his great insights about where we're heading in terms of an IMF program and as a country in the coming few months. Dr. Bisat, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. First of all, Dean Sidani and Dr. Jamalia, it's an honor to speak, and particularly at the EUB. I have an incredibly warm sense and a warm feeling towards my alma mater. And I was hoping to do it in person, and I hope to do it in person at some point soon. So listen, what I was hoping to do, if you don't mind, is go through 4 points, right? The first of which is a broad political statement I think we need to start with. Anytime we talk about the Lebanese economy, we have to talk about politics. I'm going to spend a few minutes on the structure of the IMF as an institution. I think there's a decent amount of confusion about what the institution does and what it is, and try to contextualize the Lebanese negotiations by reference to the institution itself. And then I'm going to go into the program itself and how would the program itself look like by distinguishing between two sides, between two angles. The first angle is what I call stabilization, and the second angle is what I call resuscitation, or essentially the recovery, the growth, restructuring, the transformation, right? And those two angles, the 2 parts, the stabilization and the restructuring, are going to be the core of what we as a republic are negotiating at this point with the institution. But let me start at the beginning with the political economic comment, right? And the notion here is that I'm going to spend the vast majority of the next 45 minutes or so talking about very technical stuff and fairly economic and fairly dry. And we sometimes forget that these economic discussions and economic decisions that need to be taken as part of the IMF negotiations are inherently and at their core political in nature. There's going to be an enormous amount of distribution of losses that need to be distributed across the society. And the losers are going to be fighting quite aggressively. At the same time, the kind of Lebanon that will emerge hopefully, out of a successful IMF negotiations would look extremely different than the Lebanon that we've been used to or we've been witnessing as an economy and as a system for the last essentially 100 years. And the winners of the new Lebanon, the Lebanon that we all desire, are very different than the winners of Lebanon of the past 100 years. And the people who are going to be winning will hopefully be fighting for that transformation. But let's not forget that those people will be displacing vested interests. And those vested interests are going to be fighting us extremely aggressively and extremely hard. And on that point, I personally struggle in terms of the feasibility of the kind of transformation that I'm after and I'm going to be talking about in the context of the current political system right now. And I struggle between two very different approaches. One approach that says that there's nothing that can be done until we do start with the political transformation. And until we change the politics that would allow the economic transformation, nothing can be done. And it would be absolutely vain and absolutely a waste of time to try at a time when the political system remains as it is. And that's obviously the very pessimistic and bearish outcome, because unfortunately the vested interests remain. They're very powerful, they're very vested, they're very vicious, they're very rich, and they're very sectarian, and it's going to be very difficult to displace them. And if that is the prerequisite for transformation, unfortunately we need to be very pessimistic. The optimist in me, and there's always an optimist in me, believes that this is partly a sequential game, a game where you start with easy wins. You start with certain moves. The moves themselves create a virtuous economic cycle. The virtuous economic cycle itself creates a political transformation, and the political transformation over time leads to a political shift that allows the continuation of the economics. And while optimistic in theory, I have seen it in other countries, right? There have been other countries in which the virtuous cycle of economic change leads to political transformation over time that eventually leads to a complete change in the fabric, not just of the economy, but also the society. I've seen it in Latin America, in places like Chile, in places like Argentina at some point before the crisis recently. You could even argue that even in places like Greece, we're seeing something similar to this. Even in places like Turkey, until 10 years ago, we had a transformation of this kind. So the optimist in me believes that this is not impossible and that we need to start. Am I completely optimistic? Am I completely think that we can do the economics that we're talking about in a second without a political transformation? Probably it's not easy, and I wouldn't give it an incredibly high probability. But I do believe that we owe it to ourselves to start. But completely recognizing that economics by itself is not going to be enough. And at the back of our minds, we need to be seeing the economic changes as presaging a political transformation. Otherwise, we'll never get to where we want to be down the road. And as I go through the technical discussions in a second, I will try to contextualize them politically as much as I can as I go. That's the first point I wanted to cover before we start. The second point I want to cover is I think there's an enormous amount of uncertainty and confusion about the institution that we're about to start. No, we actually did start negotiating with the IMF right now. And there's two things that I wanted to discuss. What is that institution and what are we asking for? What are we as a Lebanese, as a republic asking for, right? The institution itself is fairly unique among other multilaterals, right? No other multilateral institution, not the World Bank, not the UN, not the ILO, looks like the IMF. The IMF is a very different institution in a number of regards. Of all of them, it's the least bureaucratic. Of all of them, it's the least political. And of all of them, it's the one where the staff is by far the strongest, right? The staff matters in a way that in other institutions, the staff doesn't. I'm not saying it's not bureaucratic, I'm not saying it's not political, and I'm not saying the staff determines everything. All I'm saying is that relative to other institutions that we've historically dealt with in Lebanon, whether it's the bilateral, as part of SADR, the World Bank, the UN, we're dealing with a very different institution here. The staff matters. We're going to be negotiating with two levels of staff. I mean, the institution, after 100 years of being created, has figured out a way to make the negotiations as difficult as it can. And it doesn't allow loopholes. So we're going to be dealing with two levels of staff. We're going to be dealing with the area department, the Middle East department will send the Lebanon team that we're going to be talking to. And the problem is that those people, the staff, which is very powerful and very technically sound, and they're the most apolitical in that they approach this very much from an economic and a very technical point of view, have historically, quote unquote, gone native, right? Have historically allowed the republic, the country that they're negotiating with, to compromise. And as a result, the institution over time has re-indoctrinated that staff by sending along with them staff from a different departments, what we call functional departments, right? The departments that are pure expertise. They're not regional. Right? They're balance of payments, debt, banking, fiscal. And those people are significantly more hawkish and significantly more technical and harder to deal with than the area department itself. So we're dealing with a fairly orthodox group that will not be as open to political considerations and compromises and and notions that we can't do it, give us some time, we'll do them down the road. These people will want everything, and they will want it right now. The good news is, again, is that I said they're not political and technical, but they're not completely so. We still have, at the end of the day, groups within the fund, particularly the senior management, that tends to be more political. The senior management tends to be more geostrategic in the way it thinks, and as a result, can influence the staff, can influence. And so we are dealing with economists, we're dealing with technicians. They're going to be very hard on the Republic. But at the end of the day, there will be a political angle and a political element, and we have some leeway and some room to maneuver. But this is not said. This is not dealing with, I'm going to be very open with the French, where this is dealing with much more of a technical organization in a way that is different than other organizations. And it's going to make it much harder. What are we asking for from the fund? Once we start the negotiations, what are we asking for? And I think there's also some confusion in terms of what the country, what we're asking for, right? The IMF is not one program. The IMF has a whole spectrum of programs. And I'm going to give you a sense of where I think we'll end up on that spectrum, right? The fund has historically dealt with countries in trouble at multiple levels, right? At one level, they are purely consultative, right? They are smart people who have models, who are very good economists, who know the country economically, not politically, but economically better than anybody else, because they've been studying it all day long for years and years. They have the models and the numbers. And they can come up with a framework, like a consultant. They can come up with a framework, and that framework is updated annually. It's called an Article 4. And they can discuss it with authorities, and even whether you're in trouble or you're not in trouble, that discussion is useful in and of itself, right? So that's one element in which we can engage with them. We can go to them and say, you as consultants, help us, give us ideas of what we need to be doing. The next level over is what is the traditional bread and butter of the IMF, which is called is a staff monitored program, right? There's no money involved at all. Essentially, you go to the authority, to the fund, and say, the program that you described as part of the Article 4, we're going to have a discussion with you. We're going to try to modify it in a way that we think is doable. We commit to it, and you monitor us, right? We're not going to promise anything. We're going to commit to it, but we're not going to promise. There's no conditionality in it. There's more of a framework agreement. You monitor us. And the fund, at that point, signs an agreement, staff monitored program. That agreement is quite useful because we can take it and go to other bilateral and multilateral sources and get funding from them based on the SMP. But that document itself will not unlock IMF money itself, right? I don't think there's an argument that we should go there, and that's what we should be asking for. I personally see some merit to stopping there for reasons I'll get to it later on. But then we can be more ambitious and go for the next level of the engagement, which is a historical, traditional, what I refer to as a standby agreement. Standby agreement tends to be between 9 months and 1 year. It tends to be limited in its conditionality, but it has conditionality, right? We need to promise certain things, and we will not get the funding unless we actually deliver. The funding itself will be dispersed over time. It won't be one disbursement. It'll be multiple disbursements, typically quarterly, but it will be based on certain things that we need to do, and we need to not just commit to, but actually deliver. That lower level conditionality tends to unlock what we refer to as one quota. Our quota is roughly $1 billion. So if we commit to a standby, that's what we're looking for. We're looking between $800 and $1 billion. It won't come in one go. It'll come in multiple quarters, in 3 to 4 quarters. It will be based on certain, what we refer to as prior actions. We're going to have to do something before we see even the first dollar. And then we stop. And then we say, and that's it. We'll talk about something bigger down the road. There's the fourth level, which is by far the most ambitious, what we call upper conditionality type arrangements, which is the most famous of which is the Extended Fund Facility, the EFF. That tends to be a 3-year program. That tends to be significantly more ambitious than a standby. That one doesn't just deal with the basics, it deals with transformation. It deals with a structural change. It tends to happen in partnership with the World Bank. Usually it's a joint program between the bank and the fund on this. And that one will unlock, it will also be quarterly disbursement. It will not be one go at all. It'll be multiple disbursements, typically over 3 years. Every quarter there's a revision. If you review, if you do what you're supposed to do, you get the money. But that arrangement, the EFF, it can unlock significant amounts of money, and it's unlimited, right? I mean, there are countries that have gotten tens of quotas, not just one, right? There's and the more ambitious the program, the more the funding behind it as well, right? I personally think Lebanon is going to have to live between the second and the third, not the fourth, right? We're beyond an Article 4. I think there's enough people who've told us what needs to be done, including yours truly. But I don't think we have, even though the people who are now negotiating the program, who, by the way, I have the ultimate respect for, and I should say this at the outset, particularly Dr. Shami, who used to be a professor at the UB as well. I have the ultimate respect for. And Dr. Shami is committed to, as is the Prime Minister, by the way, is committed to the most complicated, the EFF. I personally think it's the more ambitious, the more realistic one is to live somewhere between SMP and a standby. And politically, it's going to be very hard to do the kind of transformative policies that are needed to really get to an EFF. I mean, they're committed to it. That's what they're saying they want to do. But once we go through the details of what it needs to get to an EFF, my conviction, I don't know whether you'll agree with me or not, is that it's way too ambitious given the political moment and juncture that we're in right now. So that's sort of the second point I wanted to make, which is that the fund is an institution that is much more orthodox and much harder to deal with. And so I was wondering, I was reluctant to say what I'm going to be saying right now, but I'm going to say it anyway. We cannot do it al-Lebanese, right? This is not an organization that we can deal with the way we've come to deal with unfortunately, a lot of our engagement. We have to deal with them in a much more serious, much more professional way. This is not, and once we start the negotiations properly, we need to have a good idea about what we're asking for. And my sense is that maybe we should ask for the perfect, but maybe we have to accept, given the political juncture we're in right now, the acceptable and the doable rather than the perfect, which, to my mind, is a standby agreement, and maybe even an SMP. Maybe that's as ambitious as we can get at this point as an SMP. And SMP itself could end up being a good vehicle, because while it might not unlock IMF money, it could be used to unlock other monies, because other countries and other organizations are okay with an SMP. So now brings me to, that's a good segue into what is it that we're negotiating for? And in my mind, and the way I've written about these things, I've divided the project into two segments, right? And what I call the stabilization part and what I call the restructuring part, right? And I think the best metaphor to see that kind of distinction is a house on fire. Right? When your house is on fire, you don't start thinking about the redesign, the redecoration, the rebuilding. The first thing you think about is stopping the fire. That's your ultimate objective, and your number one objective is stop the fire, stop the collapse, stop the implosion. Once you do that, you can start thinking about rebuilding the house. But until you get to the point where the house is no longer on fire, we cannot start thinking about the next step. And I think that's a good it's a good framework to think about the difference between an SBA and an EFF. An SBA, the more limited, less ambitious program that I think is one that deals with stabilizing, stopping the rot, stopping the collapse. And that we do that only once we're done with that can we start thinking about rebuilding the house and re-transforming the economy and re-transforming the country, right? What does stabilization mean, right? Stabilization, what is a fire in Lebanon right now? I mean, it's fairly straightforward and no need to spend too much time on it, right? The fire in Lebanon right now is arresting a number of things. You want to arrest the currency from its continuous implosion. The currency, as you know more than I do, the currency is on a linear move higher. You want to stop inflation, which is obviously directly related to the weakness of the currency, but not the only explanation of the inflation and price increase. The currency in and of itself, there are other reasons I'll get back to in a second, but you want to stop prices from galloping the way they're galloping right now. You want to stop reserves hemorrhage. Reserves of the central bank are assets, of your strategic assets for the future. You're going to need them for the rebuilding. You're going to need them for the transformation I want to talk about in a few minutes. So you want to stop the hemorrhage. And number 4, and perhaps the most important for most people, you want to stop the economy from collapsing. You want to bring back economic activity. The wrenching recession, the gargantuan recession that I talked about in one of those articles is unsustainable and is creating scars that are extremely long-term in nature. The immigration, the complete collapse of capacity, economic capacity, the security implications of the economic collapse, at the limit, the return of the civil war. The need for stopping the economic collapse is clearly part of what I call stopping the rot, stopping the fire. What does that mean? How do we do that? What is the IMF's framework for stopping the rot, right? And extinguishing the fire, as it were, right? There's a number of elements that are going to force us into doing, and you will see once I go through that list, is that each of them is politically extremely difficult. Right? Let's not make, I don't want to make them sound like they're arithmetic and a spreadsheet type of analysis. Each measure is a measure that has implications, real economic implications, but also real political implications. So that's why the negotiations are not going to be easy, even at that level, right? The first thing that they're going to ask us to do is they're going to say the currency's collapse is, as is inflationary spiral, is partly a monetary phenomenon. It's not completely a monetary phenomenon, but partly a monetary phenomenon, right? The explosion of liquidity in lira that we've seen over the past 2 years, right? I mean, at some point, lira liquidity was expanding at 300% a year. Now it's 75%, but still, it's an incredibly high annual growth rate. That liquidity, at the end of the day, is creating a demand for dollar and a demand for real goods that is creating both the currency weakness, but also the inflationary pressures. Right? So at the end of the day, these exchange rate and inflation are monetary phenomena. Not completely, but partly monetary phenomena. So we need to stop the explosion of domestic liquidity that we're seeing right now. The problem is that, and I think unfortunately not a lot of people talk about this, is why is that liquidity being created? It's not being created because it's being created out of nothing. It's created for a reason. The conventional wisdom is that it's being created to fund the government deficit. It's monetizing the deficit. The reality, it's not. Once you look through the numbers, and I'll get back to that in a second, we're surprisingly austere on the fiscal side. There is much less monetization of fiscal than one would have expected, right? And that's not the narrative out there. Most people think the monetary expansion is a monetization of the deficit, the central bank lending the government. That's not true. Most of the liquidity increase is happening because people like you, myself, my parents are going out there and withdrawing lira from the banking sector, their dollar deposits from the banking sector in lira at a very artificial exchange rate, extremely painful exchange rate, the 3,900, but that's creating lira. And that lira is being supplied by the central bank, right? So part of the way in which you can tighten liquidity and tighten monetary policy requires unfortunately, some work on the banking sector, some controls on liquidity creation. We need to also think about sterilization and ways of sucking that lira out of the system. But the first thing to do is we need to tighten monetary policy. Without it, inflation is going to remain extremely high and the currency will not stop. And to do that, you need to do something about withdrawals and banking sector deposits, and you need to sterilize, but that's going to be something they're going to be asking for quite a bit. But lira supply is not the only reason the currency is weakening. The other reason the currency is weakening, and here I'm not telling anything you don't, is that people are desperate for dollars. Right? There's this the store of value argument for owning dollars at this stage is extremely high. Speculative demand for dollars remains extremely high. Commercial demand for dollars, by the way, has shrunk massively because imports have collapsed. Our current account deficit is almost non-existent right now. Instead, the dollar demand that is leading to this exchange rate collapse and weakening of the lira is happening because of speculative reasons, and cautionary, right? Precautionary reasons. People want the dollar because it's the only store of value that they have right now. Unfortunately, we need to control that. Capital controls that we've been talking about forever needs to be reinstituted. And we need to introduce a system of rationing of dollar supply into the system. Right? Unfortunately, We need to go back into a system in which dollar inflows have to be controlled in a way that tries to limit the demand for dollars to commercial reasons rather than for speculative or precautionary reasons. Extremely painful, because most of us want to own that dollar because the lira has no value. I want to own a real store of value. We need to control that as well, unfortunately. The fiscal side is very interesting, and it's going to be an incredibly difficult part of the negotiations. But that's different than other countries I've come across. I've worked on many crisis countries in my career. And usually the IMF comes in and tries to stop the fiscal because the fiscal is running a very large deficit. And the deficit itself is either unfinanceable, nobody wants to lend them money, or because it's leading the central bank to lend them money, and the lending of the money is through lira, and that creates inflation. It's shocking how austere the Lebanese government has been for the last 2 years. I don't think people realize this. But in the face of the collapse of revenues, and revenues have collapsed by 75% when measured in dollars, they come down from $9 billion to around $2 billion in dollars. In the face of that collapse of revenues, the government has surprisingly collapsed spending as well. The government has literally gone on strike, right? Literally, government spending, also measured in dollars, has also come down from $9 billion to $2 billion, right? In fact, what was shocking is that even in lira, right, not just in dollars, but even in lira, government spending has actually come down, right? Again, we can talk about why that is happening, but the point here that I was going to make is that in terms of the objective of resuscitating the economy, which is the most important objective of stabilization and stopping the fire, you need to resuscitate the government itself. You need to restart the government operations. Things like public services, health, education, maintenance, security, right? These things are absolutely necessary, right? So the IMF, surprisingly, is going to condition us, is going to ask us to spend more, something that they've never done before historically. They're going to ask us to spend more. The problem, and obviously that's not going to be a difficult thing, we all want to be spending more. That's not a hard condition. The condition that becomes hard is that once they ask us to spend more so that we can resuscitate the economy and grow the economy, we need to raise revenues. Right? Because at this point, not the reason why we've cut spending is because revenues have collapsed. So if we're going to be spending more, and we need to spend more, we need to be increasing revenues. We're going to have to be having a huge fight with IMF on increasing revenues. Right? We have to look, and we can get into the details of what that means. There's going to have to be new taxation, new redenomination of the tax base. But in order to spend more, which is absolutely necessary to resuscitate the economy, there's going to have to be a revenue increase measures that are needed on the other side as well. Finally, and we're still talking about sort of turning the fire down, is sort of extinguishing the fire, and this is there are two brackets I want to open. The first bracket is that one of the reasons why the economy has collapsed in Lebanon is because of shortages. Right? Shortages of oil, of the electricity. Like I saw right now, the electricity so the electricity, and unfortunately, the shortages have to be dealt with by the reason there is a shortages in the country is because the domestic cost of producing the goods and supplying the goods is not, at this point, does not reflect the actual cost of producing and importing them. Right? That's the reason the shortage exists. We can talk about conspiracy theory, we can talk about monopoly, and they all exist. We can talk about smuggling, and they all exist. But the core reason is that the domestic cost of producing and supplying goods is lower than the cost of importing them and or producing them. Right? So the quote-unquote good news is that we have re-equilibration of that price. The removal of the subsidy, painful as it is, and I'm going to get back to it in a second, and it is painful, is an important part of the reduction in the shortages, which itself is going to be beneficial to the economic activity and economic recovery, right? And I think we are there. I think you would all see that the shortages, they're extremely expensive, they're very painful for those who own in lira, and most people earn in lira, but at least now the shortages have become less severe, right? Which brings me to my second bracket, and that's the last point I'm going to talk in stabilization, is that, and this is new to the IMF, the IMF is going to tell us you need to support the population and the productive sector with a one-off financial transfer to offset the pain that comes from the removal of the subsidy, which was necessary to reduce the shortages. So the IMF is going to push us hard to do demand management policies, which they've never done in the past. That's a new phenomenon, a new criteria that the fund has done recently, is demand management, is cash transfers, direct support to the population and to the corporate sector, the productive sector. Right? They're going to ask us to do that. And the good news is they've given us money to do that, which is the SDR allocation. Right? So they're going to be asking us to use some of the SDR allocations, the World Bank loans, maybe the French humanitarian assistance, to provide domestic support to the households and to the corporates to help them during the process of transformation, of stabilization that's going to come as a result of the subsidy removal, higher taxation, tightening of monetary policy, and restrictions on bank. Everything I mentioned is extremely painful. So they're going to ask us to give money. And here, just like a political parenthesis, I am shocked that we haven't done that yet. البطاقة التموينية, the ration card, the fact that we still haven't done it yet, that we haven't started I mean, it should be the easiest political thing in the world to do, is to give money away, and the money exists. And the fact that we haven't done it yet is mind-boggling, but that's a separate point as well. So this is the third point I wanted to sort of touch upon, which is the stabilization program. So the stabilization program is going to require significantly tightened monetary policy, higher tax revenues, capital controls, and rationing of dollars, and it's going to require as well demand management effort associated with disbursement of monies to the population. Once we do all of these things, you will get almost arithmetically to the point that to the objectives, which is the currency will stabilize if you take out money supply and reduce money demand. The economy will start recovering if government starts acting again and spending again. The economy will do better if we give the cash that I think we should be giving as part of the demand management project. And as a result, you also will get inflation will also stabilize at where we are right now. However, and this is the final part of my introductory remarks, is we've done this. We've stabilized the economy, right? We stabilized the currency. We stabilized inflation. The economy stopped collapsing. Reserves are no longer being hemorrhaged. What next, right? Here, there's no straightforward answer, right? I have seen, and I've actually done the math on this. I looked at 109 episodes of countries that collapsed by 10% or more over 2 years, right? So countries that have experienced the kind of a recession that we're experiencing. And then I looked at what happens afterwards, after they stabilize, after the crisis is done, what happens afterwards? The problem is, the bad news is there's no automaticity. Half of the countries recover, half the countries stay where they are forever and ever. So there's a huge difference between an L shape and a V shape. And the last thing we want to do, clearly, is to have an L shape. We've already collapsed, and the last thing we want to do is stay where we are for the next 10 years. Right? That's a very different Lebanon than the Lebanon where we've collapsed and then we recover. Right? And the difference between staying where we are and recovering is the transformation project, which is the last segment, part of my talk. And here, this is about restructuring, right? You've stopped the fire. It's now about the rebuilding of the economy. And rebuilding the economy is about, partly as you're a business school, it's about rebuilding the balance sheet, right? So I'm going to distinguish between rebuilding the balance sheets And then at the end of the day, the last point I'm going to make is I'm going to be talking about changing the management of the company. So not only do you want to clean up the balance sheet of the company, you want to also clean the management of the company. And the EFF, the big program that we're going to ask us for, will insist on both of these things. They'll insist on cleaning the balance sheet, but also changing the management of the economy and the management of the country. Right? So what does changing the balance sheet mean? Changing the balance sheet means three things. Right? The first thing, and by far the most important, and the one that they're going to ask us to do almost on day one, is bringing back debt sustainability. Right? Our debt at this point is, and defaulting on debt is not dealing with the debt. Right? That's a misnomer sometimes. The fact that we stopped paying the debt doesn't mean that we're sustainable, because at some point we still owe that money. We need to deal with the face value. We need to deal with the stock of debt, and we need to reduce it. Right? The reduction of the debt is not just about bringing down the face value. Right? That's one element of it, but there's multiple other elements in which we can do in order to bring that level of debt overhang, the debt, that we can extend the maturities. We can make our debt, instead of 7 years, we can make it 100 years. Nothing can stop us from making the maturity significantly longer. Right? We could keep the maturity shorter, but pay no interest, no coupons whatsoever. Right? We could do a haircut as well, right? We do a face value, right? There's multiple factors. The devaluations itself has reduced the value of the debt in lira, right? Significantly, by the way. Right? So we've already have some debt relief that has come as a result of the devaluation. So we need to sit down with the creditors as soon as we can and come up with a restructuring program at the end of which the debt is sustainable. And the debt is sustainable is in the eye of the beholder as a concept, right? It could either be because the debt to GDP comes down to levels that the world sees as sustainable. 60% of GDP sounds about usually what countries go for. It could be measured by ability to service that debt, right? So if the interest payments are so low, you care less about the amount, right? So you focus more on the flow concept. The bottom line is we need to sit down with our creditors very soon and come up with an approach and an agreement that brings down the debt, both as a stock and as a debt service, to a level that is sustainable over the medium term. And that's something that the fund is going to be asking us to do. Right? So that's the first balance sheet item. And without dealing with the debt, growth will not come back. Right? You cannot re-lever the economy. You cannot re-liquefy the economy, which is a core part of growth, unless you deal with the debt. The problem, and that brings me to the second balance sheet, is that if we do that, somebody has, like, that helps the people who borrowed the money, the government. It's going to hurt the people who lent the money, right? And there are three segments of people who've lent us the money. The foreigners, right? We don't care about those. I shouldn't say this, but the foreigners, we can. The second is the people who lent us the money in lira, right? And those tend to be ضمان الاجتماعي. Like, I'm extremely worried about the social security system. All the naqabat, all the ones who've lent money to the government in T-bills, right? We need to deal with that, and that's part of the fiscal problem I want to get back to later on. There's a time bomb here with all these entities who've lent money to the government in lira, and now their assets have disappeared completely as a result of the devaluation. And the third, by far the most important, is the bank depositors, because banks are the ones who lend the money, which brings me to my second balance sheet, which is the banking sector, right? Listen, here, honestly, there's no confusion. I think at this point, it's fairly well understood. The losses in the banking sector are so large that some form of burden sharing is absolutely necessary, right? And my framework of looking at the bank sector, and we can talk about it in more detail if you want afterwards, is to consolidate the commercial banks with the central bank together, as opposed to looking at them separately. Just consolidate the two, because the problem is that the banks have lent money to the central bank, and the central bank is in default right now because they're broke. So if you consolidate the two, you look at all the assets of that consolidation, and you look at all the liabilities of that consolidated system, the net number is around $55 billion. The net loss is roughly $55 billion. And that 55 billion is not the whole story, because even if you cover it somewhere or the other, I'll get back to how you cover it, you still need to recapitalize the banking system, and you need to re-liquefy the banking system. So the 55 is the lower end of what is needed. The number will end up being significantly more. There's a ladder of steps that are needed that I mean, there's no magic to this, unfortunately. There's a lot of people talk about it in mystery. There's no mystery to this. There's a ladder of steps that we need to do. The bankers have to lose their capital. Right? This is not about punishing them. This is the fact that this is their equity, is the lowest part of the capital stack, and when you lose, you are the first person to lose, is the equity holder. Right? The second level of the ladder is recapitalization. Right? You're going to ask them to bring some new capital in order to cover that loss that I talked about, or you could ask some of the depositors to substitute some of their deposits into debt. It's debt equity swap, right? So or deposit to equity swap. That's another element of what you need to do, right? So it's no longer a liability, it becomes an equity, right? The third step of the ladder is what do you do with the depositors, the rest of the depositors? And here you could and you should, in my mind, distinguish morally between small depositors and large depositors. You should save as much as you can the small depositors. Then what do you deal with the big depositors? How do you deal with the large depositors? There's a menu of approaches. You can ask them for some lirification. You can ask them you've already asked them for debt equity swap. You could turn their assets their deposits into a bond, a perpetual bond, where they keep interest. They get the interest, but they never get their maturity. So there's multiple. You could give them a face haircut as well, an actual haircut. These are all ways to skin the cat, and the skinning the cat is about how do you cover that loss and recapitalize the banking system. The sooner we start this effort, the better. The idea that, and there's going to be a lot of winners and there's going to be a lot of losers, which to me, why I've been calling aggressively for what I call a bank restructuring association. This effort should not be done behind closed doors at the central bank. This effort should be done by an independent agency, right, that can decide and make decisions at the level of autonomously decisions, which should not be left to politicians and to the central bank and to the parliament. It should be done by an independent bank restructuring association. Finally, the third balance sheet is the public sector balance sheet. Here, I'm gonna tell you something that I think a lot of people are going to be surprised by, right? The objective of restructuring the public sector is partly about ensuring that we don't run the kinds of deficits that have led us to the problem that we had in the past, right? So we need to make sure that we have enough revenues that cover more than enough spending, that we run this thing called the primary surplus. In other words, our spending is slightly less than our revenues before tax, before interest, so that the debt doesn't go up again. And that's an objective, and we need to make sure that that is part of the long-term program. But that's not enough, right? Lebanon's public sector is strangely inefficient in a way that is very strange and not very well understood. The Lebanese banking sector, the Lebanese government is surprisingly small. People sort of think that it's inefficient, it's extremely corrupt, the money is going to the wrong things, but it's not a big public sector. The public sector does not spend enough on the things that it should be spending money on. It spends them all on so let me give you numbers, right? Before the crisis, obviously, our spending to GDP before interest, primary spending, was 22 percentage points of GDP. The average EM, average emerging market spending, public sector spending, is 27, right? So we underspent. The government is actually shockingly small in Lebanon. We need to spend more, not less. There are a lot of requirements on health, education, infrastructure, social safety nets. On top of it, the money that we spend, the 22%, which I'm claiming is not too big, all goes to the wrong things. It goes to the civil service. It goes through corruption. It goes through all these majalis. It goes to the army. inefficient, I mean, enormous amounts of inefficiencies go to the security apparatus, right? So not only do we need to restructure spending, massive restructuring the spending composition, but we also need to increase the spending on the things that we don't spend enough money on. So we need to increase the spending bucket, and we need to restructure it. And that's a huge political game that's going to be a fight, right? So nobody's going to be upset about spending more money. There's going to be an enormous fight on the restructuring of the spending that we need. In the meantime, Lebanon is extremely undertaxed. It feels wrong. It doesn't feel right because the middle class tends to be highly taxed because they're the only ones who pay the taxes. But as a macro, we receive the taxation is 21% of GDP. In the world, in AM, it's 26. So we're 5 percentage points of GDP below the average globally. And on top of it, our tax system is extremely inefficient because it relies on indirect taxation. We need to make it much more, and it's also very regressive. We need to make it more progressive, right? So there's a huge effort that is needed to rebalance the public sector, both on the spending and the revenue side, right? So now we've dealt with these, and here is where I'm going to stop. We've dealt with the 3 balance sheets, right? The debt needs to be sustainable. We need to deal with the banking sector as a result of the restructuring of the debt side. We need to do huge operation on the public sector. But finally, and this is the most important, the management concept, right? We need to be massively rethinking about the economic system as a whole, right? And within that, there's elements of regulation, taxation, oversight, antitrust, right? Monopoly system, the monopoly system, the legal side of the story, which legal independence, but also a complete overhaul of the legal code that allows anti-corruption, anti-monopoly. I mentioned that as well. Sectoral policies, right? Who do we want to help? Who don't we want to help? There's a huge amount of economic philosophy project that we need to be thinking about as well. So anyway, listen, Dr. Jamali, I spoke quite a bit, and I apologize for this, but to summarize, and I'm going to stop there. At the end of the day, everything I talked about, I think, is political in nature, and we need to think about the economics as a political project. We're going to be dealing with an institution, the IMF, that is quite hard, and negotiations will be very difficult, and they're going to be asking for everything. We should be asking for the perfect, realistically. I think the best we can hope for is something more ambitious until the politics change. Once we negotiate a program, I think the priority is on stabilization, stopping the fire, stabilizing the currency, stabilizing inflation, stopping the economic implosion. And once we're done with that, we have a huge balance sheet economic problem, economic challenges that we need to deal with, the end of which we also need to rethink the system as a whole to change the management of the system. So let me stop there, and I hope I didn't either bore you or lose you, and see if there's any questions or comments.
Not at all. In fact, it's thank you very much. It has been extremely informative. Thank you. So I can see the applause by participants. Thank you. So although I'm tempted to ask questions myself, I'll resist that temptation and open the floor to questions. We have a large contingent of students. Wow, all the crowd is. So we have a large contingent of students who basically are present with us today. So I'll leave the floor to them. You can either unmute yourself one at a time and ask the question, or you can, if you prefer, type it in the chat and I'll pose the question. It's really up to you, whatever you prefer. We already have one while you were talking, so I'll just start with this. So the question is from Amer Hakim, and he's asking, what comes first? Is it higher taxation of or services to be provided to justify the higher taxation?
Good question, Amer. Unfortunately, both. Unfortunately, both. And this is not just a theoretical answer, Amer. It's an actual reality, which is, at this stage, nobody is going to lend us money. right? The government has absolutely no access to capital markets. There's no domestically, there's no banking sector to lend it money to, and certainly no foreigner is going to be lending them. And if there's no funding, right, the only way you can actually spend is by raising revenues, right? So unfortunately, I think we need to do them both. We need to figure out a way, and maybe here I will spend 2 minutes on what do I mean by raising revenues. But once we do that, immediately we should be using resources into increase service, increase public sector service provision, right? I don't think raising statutory taxation at this point is feasible. I mean, we tried it with WhatsApp and see what happened. So an actual increase in tax rates is out of the question at this stage. Even increasing tax collection at this stage is also problematic given the economic situation out there, right? So it's highly, it's politically impossible, but also morally and socially very difficult to raise. So, however, there are few, I don't want to call them low-hanging fruit because there's nothing easy. Nothing is easy, but maybe something is easier than others, right? Utilities. Right? I mean, at this point, figure out how much you're paying for in lira, for electricity, for water, for all the things that we're paying for in lira right now. They've become so lower than the actual cost of production that some increase in utility costs is inevitable and is needed, right? And again, this is more about, and one should and could figure out ways to save the lowest part of the economy, the poorest people, by not imposing the increase. But if you are on a higher bracket, or if you are somebody who benefits from dollar inflows, you should be paying more for your utilities than you are right now, right? I mean, the example I give here, I'm sort of going on a tangent right now, is remember how regressive the subsidized oil was. When gasoline was so cheap before they raised its prices, what was it doing? It was subsidizing the cost of people taking their SUVs to Farah. I mean, like my sort of friends of mine were filling their SUV going to Farah for 50 cents, right? Doesn't make sense. It's very regressive. So we want to be increasing the utilities and the costs on the people who can afford it. Not easy, but I think that's a low-hanging fruit. The second low-hanging fruit or easy one is redenominate some of the costs, right? The custom. At this point, you're still paying in lira. Your taxes on importation is still in lira, even though at 1,500, right? So we can redenominate the tax base, the customs base. You could also read the property taxation. Right now, the property tax, when you buy or sell a property, or the annual tax, even though the value of the property has gone up massively in lira, lower in dollars, but massively in lira, you're still paying taxes at 1,500. You can rebalance that as well. So there are ways in which we can generate more revenues relatively quickly and use that in order to pay for the services that are needed. Finally, by the way, I have not given up on the idea of getting some foreign funding, even without the IMF. I think if we can do the stabilization program fast enough, I think there are enough bilateral governments that are willing to give us some money, and that money should be used very quickly for public services. So the priority here is do some rebalancing of some of the tax bases, go out there, get some foreign funding, use both of these sources very quickly to increase public services very quickly, because we need it. Otherwise, the country will remain in the collapse that it is right now.
Thank you. So we have a couple of other questions, which I'll try to group. So the first is about negotiations with the Eurobond holders. So the question is, what do you think is a possible final outcome for these negotiations?
I'm going to give you a theoretical answer, but I need to be very, very careful about this because of my own job. For on the record, since we're recording this, I am restricted. So even though I work on Eurobonds broadly, I've restricted myself from dealing with Lebanese Eurobonds. So I'm completely outside and I don't trade them. I don't look at them. So there's people in my team who do that. So and so I need to be a little bit careful about how I talk about this. But at the theoretical level, they're going to have to be part of the answer, right? And historically, Eurobond holders in countries that are in the kind of trouble that Lebanon is faced, sit down with the authorities, sit down with the government. The first point here is that they need to be convinced that whatever they're left with is sustainable, right? That they can be, that whatever the government leaves them, right, whatever assets are left in their hands are going to be serviced in the future. That's the prerequisite. So we're going to sit down with the government, and they want to know what the macro program is. They're going to want to know what the world is going to look like. Once they do that, once they are convinced that the country is sustainable and it can service them, they've accepted to give they've accepted a restructuring of that debt, and they've accepted usually a menu approach, right? It's never one thing, right? Some of them have opted for lower face. So if the Lebanon owes them 100, they say, fine, pay me 30. Some of them say, no, keep my 100, but instead of paying me 7% coupon, pay me no coupons for 10 years, and then pay me 1% coupon later on. Some of them accepted both, a combination of the two, lower face and longer maturities. So that's the third one, is much longer maturity. So if my bond was due in 7 years, pay it back to me in 50 years. So they've accepted a menu of compromises. And the way they think about it, by the way, is in this concept called net present value. Right? They don't look at each of those three approaches separately. They look at what the net present value of each of these approaches is, and they negotiate on what that NPV is. Right? They say, okay, I am going to accept an NPV of 30 cents on the dollar, NPV of 25 cents on the dollar. Once we agree on that NPV, we'll decide where that NPV reduction comes from. Is it from maturity extension, from face reduction, or from coupon reduction? This is not Lebanon specific. This is theoretical. This is how Eurobond negotiations have happened in the past.
Thank you very much. So I'm trying to group questions together. So we have a couple about the fiscal aspect. So the main essence is we have a very large bloated public sector, and at the same time we're looking at revenue increases when the population is impoverished. Can we really talk about revenue mobilization via taxes in an environment like this? I mean, would it make more sense to cut costs or expenditures first and then talk about revenue mobilization? So I'm trying to, group them together. So apologies if I missed part of the question, but I think this is the main gist of it.
No, I mean, this is a very extremely important question, and I really want to emphasize it. So I honestly don't think it's understood properly, right? It's about composition, not about size, right? And I'm going to make 2 points that I made in the presentation. I'm going to make again because I think they're worth emphasizing one more time. Even before the crisis, the Lebanese government was not bloated. Parts of it were extremely bloated, inefficient, corrupt. But as a macro, we never spent as much money on the things that we should have spent money on, right? We always underspend on health, on education, on infrastructure, on actual security. Right? So the idea that we could cut costs before we increase taxation runs counter to the argument that the government has never been as large as it should be. More so, and this is much more true right now, is that today, I don't know how much more you can cut. I'm saying actual government spending right now is $2 billion. It used to be $9 billion in 2019. We've already cut it down to the bones, right? That doesn't mean that there isn't a lot to be done on compositional shifts, right? On that one, and I think that's the core of what people are asking, is that money is being spent on the wrong things, right? So there has to be a fight. I completely agree. Taxation should not be increased unless we do a reshifting from the social, from the civil service that is extremely bloated, from the money that goes into security, into the sort of some of the inefficient, the pension fund system to the army, right? the political money, the political spending, بالعربي we call them المجالس. So I completely agree that until we rebalance some of that money, some of that spending from inefficient, corrupt, political spending to actual spending that helps the people, we should not be raising taxation. I agree. But the idea that we should be asking for austerity here on spending reduction before we increase taxation, I think is wrong, because we need to spend more. The government needs, it's dependent, growth is going to be dependent on the resuscitation of the apparatus of the state, of the government. Then the government has given up. We have no institution of government anymore. It's on strike. And you cannot have an economy if you don't have a government. It has to be a more efficient one, a cleaner one. I completely agree. And we shouldn't be raising taxes until we get there. But the idea that we have to cut spending before we increase taxation runs counter to the numbers.
Thank you. So I'll ask two questions about banking. The first is by Dr. Azam. So he's mentioning that there's an obvious need for consolidation in the banking sector, and that we have a large number of banks today. And he's asking, what do you think about the good bank versus bad bank model? That's one question.
No, it's great, and I'm sort of honored to be Dr. Azam. We haven't spoken in ages, but we've met in the past. Listen, let me give an introductory remark and then try to sort of answer your question directly about the good bank, bad bank, right? I think the whole approach to banking sector restructuring right now that is being discussed is wrong, in the sense that it's being done behind closed doors. It's being negotiated at the political level. I think the central bank is more involved in it than it should be. The central bank is part of the restructuring need. It cannot be both the player and the referee. It's being done so far at the systemic level, not at the individual level. We still are talking about the banking sector as a whole, as opposed to the banks themselves. So as an approach, I've been very vociferous on the need to do two things. The first thing we need to do is complete rewriting of the banking code to allow for the kind of banking restructuring that I think is absolutely is clear and not I think is necessary. At this point, the banking code foresees a banking restructuring. The code itself was written in '66 after the Bank Entra debacle, and it was very much based on one bank in trouble, not the banking sector as a whole. So we need to rewrite the banking restructuring code, because we don't have a code right now that allows us to do that in a formal way. And the second thing that we should do in the approach is as I was saying, I think we should be creating a sort of an agency, a temporary agency that will get dissolved after a few years, a bank in a BRA, Banking and Restructuring Association. And that's the model that you saw in the US with all the resolution trust banks, in Turkey, the BCRA, in Argentina, in Greece, in Cyprus. All the restructuring effort tends to be taken by a banking restructuring agency, not by the parliament, not by the central bank. Right? It has to be done at a form and guided by a code, a legal code. Right? Once you do that, once you have these things, then you have, once you create that legal system and the institutional apparatus, then you need to do a bank by bank asset quality review. Right? I can't believe that we haven't done it yet. Right? An AQR is something that can be done in 3 months' time. We know exactly which bank owns each. Was a clean bank, was a bad bank, what the losses are at the level of the bank, and based on that AQR, you allow the BRA, the banking restructuring agencies, to make the hard decisions that are necessary. You're going to be closing some banks, almost necessary. If you're completely beyond salvation, you should be closed. You should be merging other banks, right? If a bank that is okay but survives with a bigger bank, you force a merger. You could put some banks under probation, and you could. I'm not saying we've all proposed an idea like this. I don't think it's necessary but one of the possibilities is to create a good bank bad bank structure, which has worked in the past, where you take all the good assets. And you allow the banks to keep all their good assets. You take all the bad assets and you put them in an SPV, right? All the bad, which are essentially debt to the government. You fund those bad assets with the depositors, with large deposits. You freeze these deposits and you put them in that SPV. And then you turn that bad bank into a private equity, right? As the assets, bad assets get resolved, you release some of that deposits. In the meantime, you're left with some banks that now have good assets, because some banks do have good assets still, right? Foreign assets, domestic assets, and let them operate and start so be part of start their operations one more time and allow depositors to withdraw deposits. That's one approach, and it's a possible approach. Other countries have done it, but I think before we get there, we need a legal review, we need an asset quality review, and we need an institution structure that allows us to make these decisions, something that we don't have right now. Right now, it's all being done behind closed doors by politically motivated and politically vested individuals.
Thank you. So a follow-up question on banking by Mr. Saad Jamaluddin. And he's asking, you mentioned an independent entity whose role is going to be to deal with the restructuring of the banking sector. He's asking, does the current regulatory environment in the country allow for such an entity to even exist?
So no, absolutely. I mean, it's shocking right now that, because I went through the code. The code was written in '66. We don't have the ability, and it was written. It gives way too much power to the central bank. It's very much driven by a one bank failure. Again, central bank has a role of being everything. He's the player, he's the referee, he's the goalkeeper. No, the code has to be rewritten completely. Based on the rewriting of the code, we need to create an institutional construct that will allow us to do what needs to be done, right? The way it's being done right now is absolutely wrong.
So I'll allow myself only one question, and then I'll take others. So the World Bank has mentioned in their reports that there's an insistence to safeguard or to help revive an economic model and maybe a banking sector that, I mean, has completely collapsed and is no longer really viable going forward. And I think part of the problem is essentially this. What you mentioned, the creditor hierarchy and whether bank shareholders will take the first hit. And I think this is a major problem that's stifling any progress. Do you think that this is a problem that, I mean, is there a will politically and even from the banking circles to move forward and take losses?
I mean, we're entering Jamali here into political territory that is very treacherous, right? Let me. I've noted, and this is pure conjecture and pure guessing, right? But I've been sort of involved and talking to people over the last couple of years. So, and I've definitely sensed a shift in attitude and a shift in at least recognition and accept, right? That the idea of sweeping things on the banking sector under the carpet, that was very much the model a year and a half ago, right? After the Lazar paper, the response was, you guys are too obvious, you're too explicit, you gave us all the numbers. This is not how we do it in Lebanon. In Lebanon, we throw things under the carpet and tikal Allah, things will work in the future. I think there's a recognition right now that that's not the case anymore, that that's not acceptable, and that something more radical and is needed. I don't think we're yet at the point where where they're ready to do it the right way, and the right way, to my mind, is the way I described, which is bring in an independent banking restructurer, change the laws, force a loss of all equity, all equity, force a reconsolidation of the banking system, come up with an explicit, transparent, systematic way of distributing losses among depositors, save small depositors. That I don't think is accepted yet politically. But I think at least now there's a recognition that something has to be done. And that the idea of, what was it? Deposits will be recreated by themselves is now seen as naive and not the right approach. So I think we're at the stage where we've accepted that the problem needs solution. I don't think we're at the point yet where we're willing to do the solution itself. But at least we accept that there is a problem.
Thank you. Let's move forward.
Thank you.
So we have Mr. Ali Sher has a hand raised, or he had a hand raised at least. So if you wanna please unmute yourself and ask the question.
Yes, thank you so much. Hello, everyone. First, I would thank Mr. Bisat so much for this great talk. Always learn a lot from him. So, Mr. Bisat, I would just know, please, your opinion regarding the forensic audit in Lebanon now. So, do you think it's an efficient and effective step now, or it's just a waste of money and a waste of time?
Difficult question, Ali. Okay, so I'm conflicted on this, right? The idea that a serious, you cannot have reconciliation without truth, right? And let me start with that basis. I mean, this is a lesson that we learned from South Africa in a political context, not an economic concept, that you cannot move forward unless you know what the truth is. You cannot pardon unless you know what the truth is. The idea of moving ahead and Afallahu amma mada, which is what we tried to do in 91 when we gave this pardon after the war, as if with no analysis of what happened before, is a recipe for a disaster. So in that sense, I think an idea of a serious academic work on, not academic in a university sense, but serious systematic work at understanding where we got, why we're here, and who benefited and who lost, and what were the illegal or legal steps that got us to where we are right now is absolutely necessary if we want to rebuild the economy down the road, right? There's not going to be reconciliation without truth. There's not going to be rebuilding unless we know. So in that sense, I think the forensic audit idea of the central bank is extremely important. And here, I don't want to sound by saying it should happen not just at the central bank, right? And some people say that as a way of avoiding it happening at the central bank by saying, oh, it should be everywhere. I actually mean it, right? We cannot move forward unless we understand why we got to where we are and who got us here and under what. Right? So I think there needs to be a systematic effort because otherwise we won't get to the transformative Lebanon, the Lebanon that we all want. Otherwise, we will literally be throwing things under the carpet. Having said that, I sometimes worry, Ali, that we make the perfect the enemy of the good. And we end up, we use the, we overemphasize measures and steps that are quite important, but they become distractive, right? So I'm being a little bit nuanced on this one. I'm not saying it shouldn't be done. I think it's extremely important. But this should not become the distraction from the other things that we need. Yeah, let me be more precise about this. Today, what's more important, a forensic audit of BDL or a financial audit of BDL? Financial audit is more important. I need to know what their balance sheet looks like. I need to know how much assets they have. I need to do, it's amazing that the largest item in their balance sheet today, the largest item by far, is called other. Like the largest item in their balance sheet is called other. We need to know what that other is, right? So my fear right now is that I don't want to be distracted by something that is extremely important, but the priority right now, to my mind, is a financial audit. So let's do the financial audit. Let's do an asset quality review at the level of the banks. Let's change the banking system. I'm sorry, let's start the restructuring of the banking system. All of these things are what is going to stop us from continuing to collapse. Not that a criminal investigation is not important. It's crucial to my mind, but let's not be distracted too much by it. I don't know if I don't want to give the impression that I'm against it. I'm completely think it's necessary, but let's not be distracted by it. There are more important things that need to be done right now.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have a question from Kristen Kharrat. She's asking, so first of all, she thanks you for a very insightful webinar. And she's asking, is Lebanon stuck in a debt trap? Are we looking at a debt overhang? And what are the debt servicing costs and the opportunity costs that exist because of a possible debt trap?
No, we're completely in that trap right now. Completely in that trap, right? I mean, and the problem right now is that we're being killed both by the numerator and by the denominator, right? The numerator is exploding higher because the exchange rate depreciates, so all the dollar debt keeps on increasing, and the denominator is collapsing because the economy is collapsing. So our debt to GDP today is, I mean, nobody knows because I don't know what exchange rate to use, what is the actual GDP is, but it's now the multiple hundreds of percent of GDP, right? And even if we get the inevitable real exchange rate appreciation and dollar GDP goes higher, and even if we do, by the way, the kind of debt restructuring that is necessary, we will still end up with a very high level of debt to GDP, let alone the fact that the government will need to borrow quite a bit in the next few years in order to survive. It's going to need from the IMF, from the World Bank. There is no, we have it. We have a serious debt issue right now, which is why I go back to the most important balance sheet that needs to be dealt with is the debt sustainability, is the first balance sheet, the debt. And the way to deal with it is today, not tomorrow, is start the debt restructuring efforts by, and I'm sort of sorry to repeat the menu, we need to extend maturities, we need to reduce coupons quite a bit, we need to do some haircuts on the debt, we need to bring down the debt level to a level that allows us to re-lever the economy in the future. Because the problem right now is, you use the word debt overhang. The debt is so large today that we cannot re-lever, we cannot borrow in the future. Nobody wants to lend us because our debt is so high. So we need to bring it down so much today in an NPV, in a net present value set, so that we can start re-levering so that we can grow in the future again. That's the most important, one of the most important balance sheet problems we need to deal with today, not tomorrow.
Thank you. So we have a couple of questions on banking. So one is about the bank. So do we have really hope to see an independent bank restructuring association, as you named it? I mean, is there any real hope for that in the current setup?
I mean, listen, if we use ADL, the electricity company, as an example, no, one shouldn't be hopeful. We've been after sort of like an independent commission that sets prices, and for years now, and we just can't seem to be able to get one. Same thing with capital markets authorities, still extremely political, very sectarian. So unfortunately, track record tells you that my idea is more hope than reality. The only reason I'm a little bit more optimistic on this one than the other ones is because this is where people's wealth is. And so the hope is that the pressure is, and the recognition that we need to clean up this banking system because we have deposits that need to be released. We have to bring back the banking system. There's an urgency that didn't exist 2 years ago and seems to exist right now. And so maybe a little bit more hopeful than in other sectors where similar ideas are needed but are almost impossible. I'm a little bit more optimistic here because of that urgency that has emerged. But if you ask me what is, how hopeful I am, sadly, no. Sadly, the current political structure that we're living in right now, both domestically, we're a year away from elections, if they happen. We're a year away from presidential elections, if it happens. We're in a regional context that is extremely unsettled and getting worse by the day. No, it's hard to see the kind of political will that would require that would get us to what I'm thinking is needed. Which, by the way, to bring it back, Christine, to my first point, which is that the best that I think we can hope for right now is more of a standby. To go for something much more transformative and aggressive is probably unrealistic right now. I think the best we can hope for is something more basic at this stage, stop the fire, and then hope that things change after the elections. Hopefully we get a regional settlement. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. So I think Dr. Araman has a question. You have your hand raised.
Yes. Thank you again for a great presentation, actually enlightening one. But actually, it's my question was exactly how you ended your previous answer, meaning that given the conflict of interest of those that will bring the solution, right? And inspired a little bit with how we handled the war crisis that we lived in the 80s, 70s, 80s. What would be other solutions that are more feasible between quotation, meaning that, they're more, like you said, we wait until possibly, but I mean, the Argentinian model, for example, tells us that, they get out of a crisis, then, they go into a better time, and then they go down into another crisis. Like, I'm saying, is there any more scientific analysis around that, like that's more kind of realistic in some sense of where we could be, in the next 10 years, given that, there is a structural problem that it's hard to change, and it's, those solutions that you're suggesting are assuming we can handle that in a way.
No, I mean, listen, Victor, it's a great question. I mean, again, this is why I ended up doing that analysis that I did, that 109 countries, and looked at what happened to them after.
Yes.
Just to remind you, I apologize for repeating it. All of these countries went through crisis. None of them as big as Lebanon, but they all went through severe crisis. And I said, once the economy stabilizes and the currency stabilizes and inflation stabilizes, what happens? Sadly, half of them stayed where they are and did not come out, right? So there is a 50% probability, if you go by historical evidence, there's a 50% probability that I call it the
L-shape.
the Yemenification, right? The Somalia model, right? We go down there and we stay down there for years and years and years. That unfortunately, if we don't get our act together, there is a possibility, and unfortunately, that possibility is being exacerbated by structural scars that are developing. I mean, the immigration problem that I'm sure scares all of you scares me too in a massive way. We're losing our future. We're losing our potential to grow. The potential to grow comes from the people, exactly the kinds of people who are leaving. So if we're leaving, so the probability of us being stuck at the L shape is increasing as a result of that exodus of individuals. It's also that probability of that 50% probability happening is also occurring as a result of the capacity, the institutional capacity implosion that is happening. All these companies that know how to produce are closing, right? So now, even if everything is perfect, you need years to reopen them and rehire them and reinvest in them. So I'm not answering you. All I'm saying is historically, I'm not being precise, but in other cases, there's a 50% probability if you were to use my example, my analysis as if it's scientific, right? Is that there's a decent chance that we stop the collapse, but we don't recover, which is why, the only reason I keep on writing and speaking is the prodding that we don't want to end up in that Yemenification model.
But if you may, just a quick one on this, what I'm a little bit hopeful in that, in a sense that this is not in the interest of the people actually that are governing, right? Because when you said, for example, increasing revenue, this is in the interest of the people governing, because if the external entity is asking them to spend more, let's say, to generate more revenue, then this is good for them to some extent, right? So there is sometimes an alignment between those that are in power to recover, right? But how long this might take, or
no, I would go one step further. I mean, if you were to force me into being an optimist today, I would focus on two things. The first of which is precisely what you said, and this is a political economic argument, right? More than anything else, is that the cost benefit analysis at this stage to the vested interests have shifted in a way that the cost of staying where we are has become so high relative to the potential upside that they may start changing their behavior. The second thing, which we haven't talked about, is that the exchange rate has depreciated to the point where the cost of the tradable sector has become quite attractive to produce right now. Tradables to produce, things like agriculture. And you're seeing it, right? It's still extremely limited and being constrained by other things. But you're seeing it in the agricultural sector, in design, in some high-level manufacturing. You're seeing it in individuals selling their services online abroad. So the exchange rate depreciation has given us enough of a breathing space that if we can do just the stability, and so I mean, we could see capacity coming back here, right? So if you were to force me into coming up with one silver lining, I would say the tradable sector could become the engine, if allowed, for some form of recovery. And this is where I finish where I started at the beginning. Maybe the virtuous cycle starts, right? The economy starts recovering, the vested interests allow us to do certain things, the economy recovers more, people become empowered, they ask for more political change, and then you end up in this virtuous cycle, which I've seen in other countries, by the way. I think the bar is very high, but I've seen it in other countries, and who knows? I mean, time will tell.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we're technically out of time, but we have a couple of questions. I don't want to tax your time, but may I go ahead with
Yes.
ask?
Yeah.
Okay. So one is about financial engineering and why was financial engineering viewed at the very beginning as a positive, and now it's being viewed as a very negative operation, let's say, that exacerbated losses in the system. So that's one question.
So I've thought about this a lot, actually. For the record, I was against it in 2016, right? In the sense that I thought it was a mistake. I thought it was pushing the can down the road, and it was forcing us into doing things that was going to make the situation worse and worse in the future. It was buying us time, not more than that. However, I mean, let's be give credit where credit is due. If you are sitting as a policymaker at that point and you had the option, you were forced into making it two decisions. You either allow the crisis to happen, or you gamble and you say, if I'm allowed to push the situation far, like if I'm going to allow myself some, maybe something else happens. Maybe I can be bailed out, right? And what was it that we were hoping to be bailed us out at that point? It was Sadr, right? And the promise that the government will do the kinds of reforms that Sadr needed. So if I wanted to give credit to the central bank at that stage, I would say he was in a position where he said, either I accept the pain and they become responsible for the crisis right there and then, which was, I mean, it was inevitable. At that stage, it was so predictable that we were hitting the wall, right? Or I do what I needed to do, which was nothing more than raising interest rates and attracting capital at extremely high interest rates. That's what financial engineering is, right? Buy myself 2-3 years and hope the government gets its act together to do the kinds of things that unlocks the $16 billion, whatever the number was from said, and then we can come back. And remember that this is a game that was played in the past, in Paris 1, Paris 2, and successfully, by the way, right? So I sort of understand. Now, again, theoretically, and it's easy for me to say this after the fact, and certainly easy for me to say it because I'm not in charge. Theoretically, I thought it was a mistake. I thought at that stage we should have accepted to take the pain and move on, because you could see that if we postponed, it would be much, much worse. But you sort of understand where they're coming from. To me, by the way, the huge mistake wasn't that. The huge mistake was not to devalue the currency back in 2013-14, when we started getting all the inflows after the Arab Spring. Right, and our debt was lower, growth was recovering aggressively. We got to the point where we could have devalued at that stage, floated the currency, right, and that would have, and the currency wouldn't have collapsed, because at that stage we were under a very good, the tailwind was behind, the wind was behind us. Waiting until 16, 17, when the situation had turned, capital outflow started. That was a mistake to do the financial engineering then. But I sort of understand where they were coming from. But this is, at this point, this is history. At this point, is water under the bridge.
Thank you. So another question is about privatization. So could it be that in today's environment, privatization is an opportunity for investors to buy assets at really cheap prices?
Yeah, I hope not, because that's distress selling. This is a fire sale. However, right, you don't sell now. You don't sell in the middle of a recession when the valuations are so low. that's a mistake, right? I think you have to wait, and certainly when the regulatory environment that allows you to do it properly isn't there, right? There's absolutely no guarantee that they don't get stolen, right? So I don't think you should do it right now at all. However, having said that, is there a role for state assets as part of the restructuring? Of course. I mean, the problem is so big at this stage that using state assets in an intelligent way to reduce the burden. I mean, remember, the cost is like a balloon, right? If you push it one place, it goes somewhere else, right? So if we can use state assets in a smart way, an intelligent way, we're going to be reducing the pain somewhere else. In this case, the depositors, right? So there is this way in which we could use, under the right conditions, with the right valuations, with the right regulatory framework, state assets could be used in a way that allows us to maybe deal with the debt overhang problem that Christine asked about, right? Because people start thinking about debt as a net concept, not as a gross concept. You can use some of those values, some of those asset sales to reduce the debt. You could use it as a collateral to some of the bonds that we will be issuing as part of the debt bail-in, right? So there is a role for state assets, more so if the state's assets are managed in a way that is efficient, profitable. So one possibility, one idea that Dr. Saeed, Nasser Saeed, has talked a lot about, which I think makes tons of sense, is you create a social wealth fund, you transfer all those assets to them, you manage them properly, you make them profitable, and then you start thinking about using them in a way to help you with the rebuilding and the restructuring. But doing it today in today's political system, in today's regulatory framework, in today's valuations would be a crime.
Thank you. The final question. So the final question is, how much time do you expect for the economy to recover, to stabilize, not to recover, actually? The question is about the time needed for the economy to stabilize. How much do you think that would be?
The Economic Stabilization Program that I talked about, honestly, can be done in periods measured by days and not by months or years, right? I mean, you could tighten monetary, if you had the political backdrop, you could tighten monetary policy, do the low-hanging fruit on fiscal spending, resuscitate the government very quickly, start the cash transfer program. And if you do all of these things, the economy, the currency will stabilize, inflation will stabilize. The economy will stop collapsing. You could do it in a very short period of time. Far distance from saying when does the economy recover. This is just stopping the fire. The stopping the fire, I think, can be done like these shock therapy type stabilization programs. We've seen so many of them. It's not a science. Like we've seen so many of them. They're relatively easy, theoretically, technically easy to do, politically extremely hard. But if we have the political will to do them, they can be done extremely quickly. The harder question is the recovery. When do we start? And that's a balance sheet problem. And those, if done properly, the balance sheets of the banks, of the debt, of the public sector, if we have the political willingness, those cannot be done in 100 days. But that is measured by the small number of years. You could do them in 2 years. In 2 years, you could restructure the debt, the banks, the public sector. You could do some change to the laws. So the whole 18 years idea that the World Bank has made it sort of through, I think, is a little bit of a dramatic exaggeration. I mean, I think we could, if we have the political will, which we don't. Let me be very clear. I'm not optimistic, but I'm saying in a theoretical, in a normative sense, we could stabilize the economy very fast, and we could start the restructuring within a period that is measured by a small number of years. And let me end at a positive note here. This is not where Lebanon should be, right? This is not the Lebanon that we have no business being at a $3,000 per capita GDP. This is not, we're too, I'm going to use the word good to be where we are right now. We're too educated. We're too smart. We're too entrepreneurial. We have too much of a diaspora. Right? We are too creative to be where we are right now. Right? The challenges are huge, and I'm not convinced that we're going to get them. But if we do, we have so much to look forward to. This is not the zip code where we should be. Our zip code is a very different zip code. We have a lot to look forward to if we can get our act together.
Thank you very much. And with that positive note, I think we can close the webinar. So I very much appreciate you coming, especially that it's a day off in the US today, Thanksgiving Day. So thank you very, very much. We thoroughly enjoyed the webinar. I think from the reactions that I'm seeing on the screen, everybody else did. So we're really grateful for this great webinar. I'll leave the closing remarks to Dean Sidani. Dean Sidani, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I don't have much to say. I really enjoyed this this seminar, and thank you, Ibrahim, for facilitating this. Thank you, Dr. Bisat, for being not our guest, being with us actually in your alma mater, and I'm really looking forward to see you in person, in the near future, inshallah. Thank you very much, and thanks to everybody who attended.
It was an honor and a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. And as I was saying, I also look forward to seeing you in person very soon. Thank you again.
We do too. Thank you. Bye.